Thank you, Omisa. That was incredibly hyperbolic, but nonetheless appreciated. It's great to go after a poet. I'm another poet. I first of all also wanted to thank Wafa for her courage in coming up and sharing that amazing speech. Can we have another round of applause for Wafa? That was awesome. And as I was listening tonight, I was so excited to go last because everything that has been said so far sort of forms the core of some of the things that I want to say. Sarah's statement that there are not 7 jumps between everything. John's reminder to ignore certain ideas to get to the good ones. Shahab's bringing 400,000 human creative sparks together. Wafa's courage in remembering that she is flowing water and that she is going to scrape off layers to get to the unseen. All of those are part of what I want to talk about in a talk tonight called Poetry, Australia, Kabbalah, and Crohn's disease. It's a lot. We're going to go on a little journey around the world. The first thing we need to talk about when we talk about poetry, I think that's helpful, and this is what I talk to my students about, is what poetry isn't. That's partially what poetry isn't. And I also realize, upsettingly, that it does look a little bit like me. I understand. I Googled obnoxious beret, and that's what came up. But nonetheless, I've never stood inside mustard. And I also, it's important to realize, like when I tell people that I'm a poet, they immediately say, well, why? And then also, I don't like poetry, I don't understand poetry, you know, you have to have the beret, and there's like the snapping, and yeah, man, it's about candles and like pipes, and you have to, it's about angst, man. You have to sit back and you have to say, like, here I am standing on an abyss of sorrow, whirling in the darkness of hell, which apparently just happened. Okay, I thought it was hell. Okay, but that's not actually true at all. I would like to suggest that all of us at one time were, and some still are, amazing poets because children are natural poems, and children are natural poets. One of the amazing things about raising children is to be able to see the world through their eyes again. When you're walking down the street with your child or a child, if that's okay, and they elbow you and they look up at the sky and they say, "Plane!" And you look up as an adult and you're like, "Oh, yeah, they made several. Yeah, it's a plane." And they elbow you and they say, "Oh my God, a cement truck!" I don't know why all kids like trucks, but a cement truck. And you go, "Yeah, I'm very happy for you, cement truck." And they ask you why bees fly, because, right, they're too fat, their wings are too small. Bees shouldn't fly, but we don't care as adults, right? We just go like, yeah, they can't fly. Or you eventually learn in science why it still works, but it's kind of like better not to know how it works because it's still amazing, right? And so kids remind us of that. I want to actually give you a math theorem. If Miss Bopana's in the room, she might be excited that this English teacher is going to deliver a theorem. It's not actually math. I would like to suggest to you that really wonder plus repetition equals apathy. And that when children show us these things, they are cool. Airplanes are amazing. Have you ever gone to Gravely Park, and stood underneath where the planes are taking off? That shouldn't happen. They're too fat. They're giant. Okay. It shouldn't work. Cardinals are amazing, right? But they point those things out to us, and they're amazing. And now I would like to talk to you about how Australia is just like that. I don't know how many of you spend time reading about the oceanic continental shelf. Where my students, they know that I'm very nerdy. Can I hear it? Okay. So I spend a lot of time reading about things like this, and it turns out that 10,000 years ago, during the Pleistocene era, Australia New Guinea, and Tasmania, right here, were all connected by these land bridges, right here and right here. And that land bridge, that entire landmass was called Sahul. After the Pleistocene era, after the ice caps melted, all that water had to go somewhere, so it drifted into our oceans, and the way that we see Australia today, which is right here, and New Guinea, which is right here, and Tasmania, which is right here, that's the way we see it now, as islands, as things that are separate. So a question that we might ask ourselves is, what happened to Sahul? What happened to the coolness of cement mixers? Nothing. They are still there. They are merely submerged, in this case, under millions of gallons of salt water, but the coolness of all those other things are also submerged under millions of square gallons of emails, things that we have to do every day, dry cleaning that we have to pick up, and inboxes that never seem to be full. Empty. Let me give you an example of how poetry is a kind of verbal continental shelf. Here's a poem by a poet that I absolutely love. His name's Ted Kooser. He was a former poet laureate. I call him Uncle Ted. He lives in Nebraska. I know his address. But I have to admit, we have a sort of like awkward relationship in that I'm actually the only participant in the relationship. He has no idea who I am. He doesn't know whether I exist or not, but I write him letters and I think about him frequently. But that's fine. I mean, and I do call him Uncle Ted. All right, anyway, so I want to read you a poem from Uncle Ted. It's a poem that I've read in my class several times, and I love it because what I want you to think about, what Ted has done here, is create a continental shelf out of words. A young woman in a wheelchair, wearing a black nylon poncho spattered with rain, is pushing herself through the morning. You have seen how pianists sometimes lean forward to strike the keys, then lift their hands, draw back to rest, then lean again to strike just as the chord fades. Such is the way this woman strikes at the wheels, then lifts her long white fingers, letting them float, then bends again to strike just as the chair slows as if into a silence. So expertly she plays the chords of this difficult music she has mastered, her wet face beautiful in its concentration, while the wind turns the pages of rain. Uncle Ted. What Kooser just did was make a connection between something. He made a landmass between something that we might not even think exists. When you see someone in a wheelchair, let alone someone pushing themselves in a wheelchair through a parking lot on a rainy morning, what are the first emotions that we feel? You might feel sad. You might feel a sense of empathy. You might admire her courage. But one thing probably we've never thought of is what Uncle Ted just saw. And what he saw was not disability, and I don't mean this in like a cute bumper sticker kind of way, like it's not a disability. He didn't see a disability, he saw music. He saw a woman going like this with her hands and moving across a parking lot. And what he saw when she moved her hands doing that was not just a wheelchair moving, he saw a concert pianist hitting those chords. And just as those strings in a piano vibrate, she moves. And as she slows down as if into a silence. Come on, Uncle Ted. That's not even fair. But poets believe that these connections that they're making aren't just cute and clever and, wow, look how smart I am. Now, okay, he is wearing an ascot. I promised you no berets. I couldn't find a picture of Robert Bly ascot-free. He likes ascots. I'm sorry. But Robert Bly tells us that the connections that Coozer's talking about and the connections that poets are talking about are deep and old. When a poet creates a true image, he reestablishes a connection that has been forgotten, perhaps for centuries. In order to do that, we're going to need to go back century. We're going to have to go back further than that. That's just me on the beach. Okay, with my Russian weightlifter bathing suit and pacifier, but we need to go further back. Okay, so no, that's the first selfie. That's not helpful, and that show has been on really long. But we need to actually imagine a time before Pat Sajak and Vanna. Okay, yes, that's it. Okay, so the Big Bang, that's a good time. That was before Pat Sajak. Okay, so I don't know if you guys remember the Big Bang. It's big. Okay, yeah, it was a bang. Okay, so the question is, the thing I'm interested in terms of poetry, and Robert Bly saying that these connections go back centuries, I want to ask you rhetorically, although you can feel free to yell out the answer, what is in the middle? And this is drawn to scale, by the way. This is actually the Big Bang. It was a very dangerous picture to take. What's in the middle of that explosion? Energy. How much? All the energy, ever. All the energy that ever was, all the energy that ever will be, all the energy that is. Do you know what that means? Do you know what the implications of that are? The implications of that are that this stage and Stalin's toenails and my mom's tongue and giraffe necks and the skin above my daughter's wrist and the cells in my son's heart and my wife's eyes are all made from the same stuff. Not like a cute, oh my God, man, yeah. But like actually, the same stuff. I want to share an analogy with you that comes from Kabbalah. This is the Kabbalah part of the title. And it's an idea called shivarat hakilim, which means the shattering of the vessels. Kabbalah is a form of Jewish mysticism. You don't need to be Jewish. You don't need to believe in God. You don't even need to have met a Jew except for me right now to understand this. There's a beautiful story. All you have to do is like stories. It's a good story. So God is existing. She's the entire universe in this story. She wants to make the world. She can't make the world because there's no room, because she is the universe. So she has to contract in this idea called tzimtzum. And it's an idea that a lot of people apply towards parenting, right? The idea that you pull back and allow your children to live. But in this case, God pulls herself back to create the world. And then she starts making the world. Why does she start making the world? Because she's lonely. And so she starts in her science lab. She's got her Obermeyer flasks and her beakers and her Bunsen burners. English. And she starts pouring all of her infinite light into these finite things. Well, what happens when you pour infinite light into finite things? Of course, you guys do it all the time. It explodes. It's another Big Bang. Except in this story, what happens to those creative sparks that were at the beginning of the Big Bang? These sparks have shattered throughout the universe and are now everything and everywhere. Why don't we see them? I'll tell you why we don't see them. Because they're wearing 118 costumes. They are either wearing singular costumes, if you're in science class and you're like, oh yes, I'm looking at sulfur. I smell the devil. What? Okay. Or they're wearing some combination of those 118 costumes, which is everything in the universe, and we don't see them because all we see are the costumes. But people have been telling this to us forever. And I was so happy that we saw a Rumi quote earlier, because here's Rumi again. Rumi says, the art of knowing is knowing what to ignore. That's an incredibly non-Western concept of knowledge. We think of knowledge as acquisition. Rumi is saying real knowledge is knowing what not to see. What kinds of things is he saying don't see? The costumes. He's saying don't see the water that covers the landmass that covers Sahul. Don't see this costume between me and you that makes it seem like we are so wholly different. But Rumi's not the only person that says this. If we go a little bit further east, Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Nobel, he didn't actually win the Nobel Prize because they didn't give it out in 1967, but Martin Luther King nominated Thich Nhat Hanh for the Nobel Prize. One of Thich Nhat Hanh's philosophies, it's a beautiful meditation that he gives, mirrors this as well. He says a piece of paper is one of these costumes. If you become a real human, capital H human, not lowercase human, you will recognize the universe in a piece of paper. And again, not like, yeah, but like, yeah. Why? Because Thich Nhat Hanh says we need to see inside that piece of paper the cloud that had rain inside of it, that rained down on the grass, that fed the soil. We need to see the deer that walked by one morning, licking the dew off the grass, who pooped on the grass but made the soil fresh and rich and fed that tree from which that paper came. We need to see that tree grow. We need to see the sunlight that came right to that tree and fed it. And then we cut that tree down, and yeah, we made a piece of paper, but that piece of paper is a temporary costume for the universe. Slightly hairier, but nonetheless wise, Walt Whitman says the same thing. A child comes to him in his most famous poem, and he says, "Uncle Walt, what is this grass that I have before me?" And Walt says, "I don't know. Maybe you know more than me because you're a child." But then he loses that false humility, and for 535 pages, he continues to make guesses. Some of his guesses, they're all beautiful, right? He says, maybe the grass is the handkerchief of the Lord. Maybe it's the beard of graves. But his most famous answer is a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars. Not in a cute way, in a real way. Every day when you are walking on the grass, that light that came to feed that grass came from stars that are millions and billions and billions of miles away and fed that grass. So you are literally walking on you're walking on sunshine. Ah! You're walking on sunshine. Like an 80s hit, but also like actually walking on sunshine. Except grass is better at using energy than we are. I'm a little jealous of grass, but that's for another speech. Finally, what does this do for us? So if you, let's say you take all this stuff I'm saying, you go, okay, Savett, fine. So I'm walking on sunshine, the cloud, okay, a paper, yeah, fine. What is it that we get out of this? Such a Western question, but nonetheless, we need to go to Chernobyl for the answer. Rabbi Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl, this is Chernobyl pre-bad Chernobyl, and Chernobyl says, you will become like space itself, you will be free because you will have no beginning or end. Do you see what that says? You will wear no costume. You will be free. The death anxiety that we have, the life anxiety that we have, when we realize that we don't have a beginning or end, don't sing Hakuna Matata, we realize that we will live without costumes and we will see the connections between all of these things. What does all of this have to do with Crohn's disease? I'm going to tell you. We need to take a trip to Baltimore. Go ahead and make the Chernobyl joke. Okay, so we're taking 95 north to Baltimore. I was diagnosed with Crohn's in 1998. For those of you who don't know what Crohn's disease is, It is an inflammatory bowel disease. There is no real cure for it. There are only medicines to take for it. It is also an autoimmune disease. That means two things. Number one, it means that my body is attacking itself, which seems really not nice. And secondly, the chronic inflammatory bowel part means that my intestines basically, they get thickened. So picture it, and so it's tough for things to go through. Picture it like 270 north at 455, no HOV lane. Right? That road rage, those are my cramps. This is me before my first surgery. I weigh there what I weighed in 7th grade. Don't say I look better either. But I was working out at the time. I thought I was like, all right, I'm doing push-ups. I'm running 5Ks. It's like amazing. And then I went to the doctor, and it turned out that like I had a little helper with the weight loss, and that was a chronic disease. So I had 3 surgeries, and then I went to Johns Hopkins University, which is an amazing place and has amazing doctors at the cutting edge of Crohn's therapy. So I went to Crohn. I went to Crohn's. I went to Hopkins to have a surgery, and I died at Johns Hopkins. I came back to life, but I still died at Johns Hopkins, and then I came back to life, and then I died. Brief explanation. When you have Crohn's surgery, what they do is they take the thickened part of your bowel, they snip that part off, they chuck it in the trash. I actually asked for mine. It's mine. They said that the doctor said no. He said, you don't want to see it. I said, I do want to see it. He said no. I can't even tell you how much it bothers me. I don't know where it is. Like, it's probably in New Jersey on a barge, but it makes me upset because it's like next to Twinkies wrappers. Okay. Anyway, so they sew it back together, all good. The problem is the person who sewed it back together, it's a teaching hospital. They have to learn. A student sewed it back together. The stitches tore, and the inside of my gut spilled into my abdominal cavity. I got a tremendously high fever. I was in tremendously terrible pain. I was completely out of it. They called my wife the next morning and said, he's not doing well. He's going downhill fast. We're going to try to save him. And unlike the first surgery that they do, where it's all neat and they do it laparoscopically, they make little incisions, it's all neat and nice. This time I had what's called an exploratory laparotomy, where Dr. Wang just took the sharpest scalpel he could find to just cut me from belly to neck and went in there and figured out what was going on. I'm thankful. That was great. Dr. Wang saved my life. Now, this is completely true. Dr. Wang, 2 months later, did move to Nova Scotia. He lives in Halifax. I don't know why. I feel like I need to look into it. I have some people on the scene, but he just got out of Dodge after this happened. But nonetheless, Dr. Wang saved my life. Allison and Elijah and Sapphira saved my life. Poetry built my life. Walt Whitman built me. Jane Kenyon built me. Rumi built me. Bob Dylan built me. Bach's cello suites built me. How? Tony Hoagland says that poems build our capacity for imaginative thinking, create a tolerance for ambiguity, and foster an appreciation for the role of the unknowns in human life. Imaginative thinking. When I was sitting in my, when I was sitting in my own poop at 3 o'clock in the morning one day, they get very excited if you have abdominal surgery. I don't know if you've been through this. It's kind of like heaven for me, not the surgery part, but this part. They get very excited for you to poop because it means your intestines are coming back to life. So they check in, and they're like, and I'm like, no. So it's you're laughing, like Crohn's, if anybody has Crohn's or IBS, you know, this is Disney World for Crohn's. okay? I'm not going to go into the disgusting story that some of my students know. Anyway, so one day, I get to downtown pushdowns, and I finally go, and I start to run, but I don't make it. So I call the nurse's station. I'm standing in my own stuff. I call the nurse. She comes back on the intercom and says, "I'll be there in 25 minutes. You're not an emergency." Well, the fact is, I wasn't an emergency. Poetry taught me that there are emergencies worse than mine, because I had to imagine emergencies worse than mine. Even though I couldn't lift my arms above my head without being in tremendous pain, I had to imagine being home, putting up a picture again in my house, Allison helping me, saying a little to the left, a little to the right. That's perfect. Even though I couldn't walk down the hallway without getting a seizure, I had to imagine that I could walk from the parking lot to my seats at the Black Sabbath concert that I saw a couple years later. Even though I was in the most intense boa constrictor animal pain that you could ever imagine, I also had to imagine standing at the beach long enough for my feet to settle so deep I felt like I was part of the earth. Fresh enough that each wave cooled my ankles and knees, and the horizon felt like a kiss until I was standing there. And that's a picture of that. You don't have to clap. Don't clap. No, it's fake. It's fake. It's fine. Poetry became my imagination calisthenics, my ambiguity 5Ks. When I read poems like Ted Koozer's, I got more used to the ambiguities in life. Lines like Paul Eluard's, "The earth is blue like an orange." What does that mean? But it means something that feels right to me. And if you're still like, no, you could come to class and I'll tell you, but it feels kind of right. At least somebody on the internet thought that it felt, well, I have a pointer, thought that it was right. So when I have to sit with the idea that the medication I'm taking may or may not interrupt my inflammation, it may or may not increase the chances that I am going to get lymphoma by 17% in 17 years, but I will feel really good if I take it now. Poetry is the beautiful practice of making those impossible choices. And this is why poetry is not just a hobby to me. It is not something I do on the side when I have time. It is the reason I get up at 3:40 a.m. every morning to write. It is not just an interest I list on Facebook. Because when I read poems from Rumi and Koozer, and we've talked about the electric mystic strings that vibrate inside everything, when Walt Whitman says he sings the body electric, poetry helps us love those strings. When we fall in love with the world all over again like we did when we were kids, but this time it's better because it's a second naivete. This time it is earned because we saw through all of that water. I have no choice but to remember Sahul. To remember that this whole wonderful bag of ticking meat is a combination of costumes. And when I can remember that, then I can remember that we are all creative sparks waiting to be saved, waiting to be redeemed, if not by God, if not by Hashem, if not by Jesus, if not by Allah, if not by Brahman, if not by Buddha sitting beneath the Bodhi tree. Then in the end, we will be saved just by noticing, just by looking at each other and seeing what we are and seeing what we are not. Okay. We will be saved when we see a piece of paper and know that it is the universe. We will know when we are walking on grass that it is starshine, that we are saved. And we will know when we can come to each other uncostumed and say, hey, do you remember when we were brothers and sisters in the river? Not because it's cute and not because it works, but because it's true. And it is still building.
That breaks behind the houses. I don't see what's strange about this. Tiny bubbles hang above me. It's a sign that someone loves me. I can hardly stand upright. Hit my head upon the light. I have faith but don't believe it. It's not there enough to leave it. Everything I love is on the table. Everything I love is out to sea. I have only two emotions, careful fear and dead devotion. I can't
That's
get
real.
the balance right. Throw my marbles in the fight. I see all the ones I went for, all the things I had it in for. I won't cry until I hear, 'cause I was not supposed